Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Enola Holmes 2 from 2022. Now, it's been a little bit since I watched the first Enola Holmes, and that is mainly the reason why I watched the second one. Not that long after watching the first one, the second one came out, and I marked it as the first one was okay, maybe I'll watch the second one sometime. Not necessarily setting any particular intention to do so, but it was good enough that I wanted to see what they would do with the next one. Now, Enola Holmes 2 is a bad title. As I talked about in the first video, or the video for Enola Holmes, this is actually not based on, this one is not based on a young adult book, but is an original screenplay based on the character from the young adult series, as well as some real-world historical events that it decides to use as sort of a framework for telling a Enola Holmes young adult mystery story. And where do I start with this? I watched back my video on Enola Holmes 1, and I'm almost tempted to just tell you to go watch the Enola Holmes 1 video, because with the exception of a very few specific things I called out in that video about the film itself, almost everything I said about that film is true of this film too. It has all the same problems. It has all the same positives and negatives. It has all the same structural issues due to it being sort of a weird young adult film that doesn't quite know what it is. It has all the same casting problems, etc., etc. I'm tempted to just tell you to go watch that one because it's true of this one too. But I feel like this deserves its own video anyway. I can't, without having gone back to watch the first one again, I can't really say for sure which one I prefer. I suspect that even though my feeling is that this one is pretty all right all around, that the first one has higher highs and maybe some lower lows. And this one is, even though it averages a little bit higher, is a little bit like mediocre in having no serious variability, and also losing some of the element of surprise of expecting certain qualities in this one, having seen the first one. It's how do I talk about this? The movie is struggling at the beginning. Let me just say, for one, it is very long. The first one I also mentioned was unusually long, especially for a young adult film. It is over 2 hours. And I think in the first one, that was definitely pushing it. In this one, I think that actually the pacing is pretty solid. There were no points at which I was specifically thinking or saying, oh, this scene doesn't need to exist, or it's droning on too long, or something like that. However, instead of having problems with scenes that don't need to be there or that are too long, it instead has a structural problem of not necessarily knowing where it's going until the scene arrives. And this is a quality of a lot of young adult fiction in general, I think. A lot of things aimed at younger audiences, that it's especially difficult for a mystery or drama where intrigue is supposed to be a key factor in it, and depending on how young your target audience is, attention spans or variability in like like intellectual development, because kids develop at different rates, means that you have to be kind of careful not to just lose your audience. Now, that's true, as I've discussed, of any mystery, that, like, especially in cinema, mystery cinema still has to have broad appeal. And when you're targeting young adults, I think it makes sense that you have to be real careful not to ride that line of revealing too much and not revealing enough, something I've talked about over and over. But you have to err on the side of over delivering in a case like this. And just like in the first one, this movie does spend a not insubstantial amount of time looking directly at the camera, both like figuratively and literally, and saying, oh, so this is what's happening now. This is what we've just revealed. And that in particular makes the target audience feel especially young. Whereas the first one, well, okay. My memory of the first one is that I thought it was probably targeted at like an age group maybe 10 to 15, and in particular young women. And this one feels possibly targeted even younger. The thing I was trying to get at right at the beginning of this video is that from the very beginning, it seems to be struggling in terms of having good performances from compelling actors delivering something that doesn't feel childish. The like call to action for Enola to start this mystery is delivered in such a way that feels like it's targeted at like maybe 8-year-olds. The characters that are in play, the way they deliver their lines, the lines that they are given to deliver, feels very juvenile. Not in the sense of being like unsophisticated, but just like it is very overt. It doesn't want anybody to be confused or have a chance to be confused about what's going on. And that's in spite of the fact that structurally throughout this film, there are quite a lot of things where scenes are too busy. There are too many things going on. And that goes for everything from dialogue scenes where there are too many characters in a scene saying too many different things and sort of getting their threads all tied up together, to fight scenes, in particular towards the end of the film, where between the amount of cuts and like really aggressive editing that is going on in some of it, and the sheer number of, like, I don't think this is a spoiler, near the end of the film there's a big fight scene that has like 3 or 4 different fights all going on at the same time with like 9-10 people, and they're all like individual things, and it's like 5 seconds of one fight, 5 seconds of another, 5 seconds of another, cutting back and forth. And it's not even that the production is bad. I would understand if it was like, oh, this is for kids, we don't want to show too much fighting, and we don't want it to be too violent, and we're afraid that because we have a bunch of, we have some younger actors that actually showing their like choreography might be a problem. But I don't think any of those things are true. The choreography is actually pretty good. And while I could gripe with the cinematic presentation of it, both in edit and in camera, like the actual quality of the choreography seems fine. It's very telegraphed, again, for a younger audience, and it's rather bloodless, rather almost slapstick or like cartoony in some of its violence sometimes. But they actually do it the production and the performances a disservice by the amount that they cut around. The one exception I think to this is there's a chase scene with a couple of characters, and I think everything in that scene works really, really well. It's just sort of a good presentation. There's conversations going on. There's also fighting. There's also a chase, and it all actually flows together really nicely. Digression, but that scene in particular is actually pretty good. But overall, structurally, to get back to my original point, like there is this problem of not knowing where it's going until it's there, where and that reaches into a problem that I think the first movie had as well, which is that a lot of this movie happens to Enola, not because of it, or because of her, not because of the mystery that's going on, or not because she's unveiling the mystery. There are more. There are quite a few occasions in this film where she sort of stumbles into the answer incidentally, or another character, in particular cameo characters, and I'm going to say cameo because some of them don't show up very much in the film except to do this, show up in order to deliver her either like tell her exactly what's happening, or to give her such overt hints as they might as well have just told her what the answer to the next part of the mystery was. And as a result, like, she doesn't feel like a super compelling character. And while there are, she doesn't seem to have a lot of agency, even though the what's being delivered is showing us that we're supposed to believe that she's like an independent woman or girl. She's quite young, and obviously the target audience is supposed to be quite young, and that like it's a continuation of the thread that I think is very positive of having like a positive, strong female character, but again is sort of hampered by this agency problem, and it even calls out some of its own problems, just like it did in the first one. Of Enola Holmes is Sherlock Holmes's little sister, and there are a couple of times when she basically overtly says, like, I'm living in the shadow of my family, and the struggles to make a name for myself and be an independent person are hampered not only by my family but by virtue of being a woman in Victorian era England. And that's all well and good, except for then the structure around it then like doesn't give her the opportunity to really be that independent. There are some really good things in here that go along with that, though. There's a couple of really powerful, strong scenes that are supposed to sort of mitigate some of the first movie even, and say like, yes, you were encouraged to be an independent woman and to go against the grain and to make a name for yourself and not rely too much on other people, especially not on men who may have ulterior motives or not respect you for who you are and what you're capable of. And there are a couple of scenes where they actually do a really good job of saying all of that is still true, but you still have to remember that you have allies and friends and family, and they genuinely want to help you, and you should not use that as reason to see the offers of help as combative or as counter to your wants and needs, and you should embrace who you are while also embracing that the help of other people is key to your success, that you can't be the best version of yourself by yourself. And I'm really sad that those sort of elements get buried under so much of the other stuff that's going on in this film. That would have been a really key and important theme to go through the entire thing. Since the very beginning of the movie is Enola trying to strike out on her own as an independent detective because she had her first, publicized success as a detective. and then realizing what that looks like for her. And that would have been a perfect setup for her, like, going down sort of a slightly dark path of feeling like she can't accept anybody else, and feeling like she has to do this on her own, and feeling like something they do in the film is talk about, like, she's fighting for people who they're not the wealthy and the capable and the important people that Sherlock typically goes for. She's working for the people who are less fortunate, and especially for women who are, in this, regardless of state, are in, precarious position at best during the era. And unfortunately, it just gets lost in this story. Again, she doesn't have, like, a super amount of agency, and it's weirder to me because the story is about the story is based on historical events that I was already aware of the story, and I assume that even among adults, the match factory strikes are probably not the most most well-known historical events. I think that the Sarah Chapman name caught me immediately, and I wasn't quite putting it together until it made some connections in the film, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember this. So I already knew what was going to happen. I also think the movie is pretty unsubtle about showing it's unsubtle in telling you how this is going to work out and what the actual, what the stakes are and so on and so forth. But I also say that as an adult, I was about to say film critic, as an adult who has a pretty good grasp of cinematic narrative structures, and who is actively looking out for certain cinematic elements that are clues around, because I know I'm watching a mystery film. I can't not look for clues. And some of those are pretty unsubtle. I don't think they're not unsubtle in a way where they're hammered home or they're delivered to you on a silver platter or anything. And so I'm just gonna pull back that complaint completely and say that they're subtle enough to work as reveals, but their final delivery, the way they finally show up, can be very ham-fisted. Especially because the movie uses somewhat extensively flashbacks, including to things that happened 15 minutes before. We'll just recut this footage from 15 minutes ago and give it a slight, not even severe, recontextualization of just here's where that clue was that you missed. And I forget where I was going with this, other than to say this is the structure of the film. And it goes on for quite a long time like this, sort of giving you, if you're looking, some pretty overt clues, showing you how far forward it's thinking and what the story is all about, and potentially, if you're feeling that way, getting you a little frustrated that Enola is not more on the ball. That again loops back into the fact that Enola doesn't have a huge amount of agency, and as in the first film, doesn't have a lot of character. It has better character consistency, but still problematic character consistency between her level of maturity from scene to scene, or even shot to shot, where she goes from being a capable young woman to an overly emotional child. I don't know how else to say that. And it's unfortunate because it really sort of sabotages character growth to show those inconsistencies. It just this is like 80% of the way to being a really, really solid film. Um, and I think most of the problems, in addition to just the concessions they are making in order to make it a YA film, the the focus, the very determined focus, not only narratively but tonally on what the mystery is, rather than on the character growth, which I think is usually the strong point and the most important part of young adult films is character growth. Like that's what young adult films typically about. It's not necessarily about telling the most complex, compelling story. It's about the characters who are in that story. Anyway, I'm digressions. It's just it's pretty solid, and it's pretty well paced, and it's written okay, and so much of it about it is just like almost there. Uh, I want this to be good. And it's okay. You're not going to waste your time watching this, especially if you already liked the first one. But there are a couple of scenes in particular that I can think of where it's just like, oh man, this is very childish, very like written for kids, written for like an unsubtle moral beat. And it's just so weird. I want to give it compliments for like having a pretty well balanced and subtle portrayal of like for want of a better phrase, feminist thought, and trying to give current era young women a positive viewpoint of what it looks like to be an independent woman, and to stand up for yourself and shirk the powers that even to this day are a little bit too reminiscent of Victorian era England in terms of keeping women down. And it does some pretty good stuff here, and then it just does some wholly unsubtle and clunky and over the top things that are just like, oh, we were so close. Sidebar on the childishness of this thing. There are also some scenes in here that are not appropriate for kids. Like not wholly inappropriate. Not like grotesque violence or sexuality or that kind of stuff. But there's some things that if I had a kid, I would be a little I would question a little bit if they weren't at least like 12. There's people pulling knives and guns on each other. There's bombs going off. There's like burlesque stuff going on that they've toned down a lot, so it's not like a lot of skin. It's very unsexy intentionally, but it's like I don't know, like as an adult it makes me a little like, is that an appropriate thing for a kid to see? I don't like, maybe not without the kids then having a discussion with their parents after the fact to be like, okay, here's what this was about, here's what it's trying to show, here's all these things. Yeah, it's an interesting film, and they give a hook for a third film that I think means they're probably going to keep making these. Given some of the cheapness that's on display, both in the first one and this one, something tells me these are not super expensive to make. So I would be unsurprised if this was an ongoing series. And in all honesty, I'm happy for that. I think it's a decent enough series that I would like to see these continue and improve. Doesn't get away from some of the core problems with some of the performances. But it's good enough. It's good enough. Yeah. I'm going to talk about one more thing, and it's a very minor spoiler. Well, it's not a super minor spoiler. It's kind of a minor spoiler, and I'm going to keep it low key. They introduce Moriarty, and I don't like it. because there is a Moriarty through line in this entire film, and it does not need to be there at all. And Moriarty is an overplayed character that everybody overemphasizes. As my friend who I was watching this with pointed out, Moriarty only shows up in like 2 Sherlock Holmes stories ever. And the more I was thinking about that, it's just, I was getting mad at, once again, I was getting mad at the BBC Sherlock show, because that show is so fucking stupid, like just through and through awful. Not the least reason of which is Holmes is not an interesting character because he is very clever and because he understands the world in a way other people don't, not because he has a nemesis. Sherlock Holmes, as a character as he is formed, doesn't make any sense to have a nemesis. A nemesis for Sherlock Holmes is somebody who might drive him a little crazy, but who he would mostly just want to get away from. Like, it doesn't make sense for Moriarty to be as important to everybody who makes Holmes stuff as he proves to be in so many things. And that Sherlock BBC show is just the worst for all of the shit that it does, like for so many reasons, including just having Moriarty be there all the time and just be awful. But I'm digressing again. This movie introduces Moriarty and it does not need to be in there. The Moriarty character is possibly interesting, but they do so little with the actual meaningfulness of that through line that I wish it wasn't there at all. It either needs to not be there or it needs to be the whole focus. And for anyone who's already familiar with the Holmes canon or versions of the non-canon, the interpretations, it's a very weird Holmes. Not for like the casting or the setup or anything. It's just like the character is finally revealed and then proceeds to disappear. And it's basically a hook for a third film. But why? You could have just set the character up. Like it was unclear. It sort of in the middle of the film, we were sort of wondering, is Moriarty going to be a key part of this film? Because the reveal that Moriarty is somewhere in here happens like a third of the way through. So is Moriarty important? And the answer is, to the main story of this, both yes, very important, but also could easily have been written out completely. No need. There's some spoilery things about that I could talk about more, but I just don't think it needs to be present. I'm still interested to see what they do in 3 if that's the way they're going with it, but it's just clunky in this film. Anyway, I'm going off on more and more tangents. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.